The neighborhood had always carried an illusion of peaceful order, the kind of place where lawns were trimmed to an identical height and driveways were swept clean enough to reflect the crisp suburban sky. It was the kind of community that promised security and harmony, but beneath its tidy appearance lived a system of rules, whispers, and people who found power not through kindness but control. At the center of that system was the Homeowners Association, and standing proudly at the front of every complaint, every notice, and every petty confrontation was the neighborhood's self-appointed enforcer, Karen. She was not officially part of the HOA board, nor did she hold any authority beyond what she created for herself. Yet she moved through the neighborhood as if she were its guardian, its inspector, and its ruler. Her sharp eyes scanned lawns, windows, mailboxes, and driveways with an almost obsessive focus. Every small imperfection became a personal offense to her vision of suburban perfection. And the HOA, already notorious for its rigid rules, welcomed her observations a bit too gladly. Nothing had ever escalated beyond minor annoyances, until the morning the envelope arrived. The homeowner, who had lived quietly and paid every due on time, found a crisp white envelope wedged beneath the doormat. It bore the HOA's familiar logo, stamped with unnecessary boldness as if warning the recipient of coming trouble. The envelope felt heavier than usual, saturated with a sense of disapproval that radiated through its sealed edges. When it was opened, the message inside unfolded like a cold slap. A $500 fine. The letter claimed that the homeowner had engaged in a violation of community aesthetics due to repeated driveway clutter. A vague accusation with no supporting details, photos, or previous warnings. It was a sudden and significant penalty, one that seemed crafted with the sole purpose of intimidation. And beneath the printed text was a handwritten note that exposed the real source. Reported by community member, Karen. The realization struck like a spark. Karen had always watched closely, always hovered around the edges of other people's property, always treated the neighborhood as her personal kingdom. But a baseless fine of $500 transformed her nosiness into something more dangerous. It turned inconvenience into financial punishment. It was no longer harmless interference, it was targeted aggression. At first, anger surged. It would have been easy to pay the fine out of frustration, or to argue pointlessly with Karen on the sidewalk, or even to ignore it and hope it faded away. But something felt different this time. Something about the fine seemed too polished, too confidently issued, as if the HOA was accustomed to sending these inflated penalties without resistance. The homeowner felt a push to look deeper. That curiosity began with the simplest step, revisiting the alleged violation. The driveway had been clear. That much was certain. There had been no clutter, no debris, no boxes, no tools, nothing that could justify even a warning, much less such an outrageous fine. The accusation was fabricated. It had to be. The next step was to examine the HOA's guidelines. The rulebook, normally ignored on a shelf, suddenly became a source of revelation. Its pages were filled with strict requirements, written in dense legal wording meant to intimidate homeowners into compliance. Yet as the homeowner read through the regulations, something stood out. The process of issuing a fine required photographic evidence, a formal warning, and an opportunity for the homeowner to respond. None of those steps had taken place. That discrepancy opened a door of possibilities. If this fine had bypassed proper procedure, how many others had been issued the same way? How many residents had quietly paid inflated or fabricated fees simply because they had assumed the HOA's authority was unquestionable? The issue no longer felt personal. It felt systemic. The homeowner began documenting everything: screenshots of the rules, photos of the driveway, inconsistencies in the notice, and copies of every previous communication with the HOA. Each piece of information added weight to the growing suspicion that the HOA had been exploiting its power for financial gain. The fine, rather than a standalone incident, seemed like a thread leading toward something much larger. Over the next few days, the neighborhood offered unspoken clues. Mailboxes rattled with HOA notices. Neighbors spoke quietly near their hedges, glancing around as if fearful of being overheard. Stories emerged of sudden lawn violation fees, surprise penalty charges for noise, and letters demanding payment for rule violations that homeowners claimed they had never committed. Many had paid without argument, preferring peace over confrontation. Some believed that resisting the HOA would only bring more trouble. The more the homeowner listened, the clearer the pattern became. Karen's reports appeared frequently on these notices. It was as if she had become the HOA's eyes, but the HOA had become hungry for revenue. Their partnership felt less like community maintenance and more like a quiet money-collecting operation disguised as rule enforcement. The homeowner continued gathering information, photographs of homes that had been cited, dates of notices, and small inconsistencies in the HOA's financial statements, which were publicly available but rarely reviewed. Hidden among routine expenses were unusual charges and vague entries that hinted at mismanagement. The homeowner could feel a larger scheme unfolding like a puzzle, revealing its image piece by piece at night. Lights flickered across the neighborhood as people prepared for bed, unaware of the subtle power structure tightening around them. Meanwhile, the homeowner sat near the window, reviewing everything spread across the table. Notes, documents, records, and screenshots formed a map of deceit. It became clear that this was not just about a $500 fine. It was about uncovering a system that had quietly drained the community for far too long. Days later, another envelope arrived, this one marked "Final Notice of Payment." It stated that failure to pay the $500 fine would result in additional penalties and the possibility of a lien against the homeowner's property. The letter radiated a confidence that assumed the recipient would panic and submit. But by then, fear had vanished, and in its place stood determination. The homeowner realized there was no turning back. The truth had begun unraveling, and with every step deeper into the HOA's shadowy practices, the stakes grew higher. The next phase would require strategy, patience, and evidence. And above all, it would require exposing the partnership between Karen's obsession with control and the HOA's greed. The homeowner gathered the documents into a neatly organized folder, labeling each section with quiet precision. What had begun as an unjust fine had evolved into a mission to hold the powerful accountable. The HOA had grown too comfortable in its dominance, and Karen too confident in her self-appointed authority. But the foundations of their control were about to crack, and the tremors of that shift were just beginning. The following week unfolded with an uneasy stillness, the type that settles over a community when something significant is brewing just beneath the surface. Nothing on the outside looked different. The lawns remained trimmed, the sidewalks swept, and the houses lined up with the same quiet uniformity. Yet within that stillness, a silent tension grew. A tension that the homeowner could feel every time a car passed slowly, or a neighbor paused before entering their house, or Karen herself circled the street in measured loops, observing everything with that familiar calculating gaze. The homeowner knew that confronting the HOA could not be done impulsively. It required evidence, solid, undeniable, meticulously organized evidence that could withstand scrutiny. And so, each day became an exercise in patient investigation. The first step was to gather testimonies. It began discreetly, with simple questions posed to neighbors in casual settings. A chance encounter near a mailbox became an opportunity to discuss fines. A short walk shared with an elderly resident opened the door to stories of unexpected penalty charges. People spoke carefully at first, wary of being overheard or attracting attention. But once they realized someone else had been targeted, the same way they grew bolder. One resident revealed receiving a fine for improper holiday lighting, despite not having put up any decorations that year. Another admitted they had paid over $1,000 in accumulated penalty fees after being threatened with a lien. Many had received fines reportedly issued after complaints made by Karen, even when circumstances contradicted her claims. Some felt intimidated, others felt violated, but all shared a common thread. They believed the HOA held unquestionable power. As these accounts piled up, patterns became more distinct. The HOA had abandoned proper protocol repeatedly. No warnings, no inspections, no chances for dispute. Just fines. Steady, constant, and growing in amount. The homeowner documented every conversation, summarizing anonymously to protect neighbors from retaliation. Each story strengthened the case, forming a foundation of community-wide evidence that something deeply unethical was happening. The second step was reviewing the HOA's financial records more thoroughly. These records, buried in annual reports sent to residents but rarely examined, presented a troubling picture. There were entries labeled with vague descriptions: administrative adjustments, community enforcement processing, and special compliance evaluations. The sums attached to these labels were large, unaccounted for, and inconsistent with the actual expenses of maintaining the neighborhood. The homeowner noticed a disturbing trend. The HOA's income from fines had nearly tripled over the past year. Yet, operational improvements in the community were non-existent. Roads hadn't been repaved, common areas remained unchanged, and maintenance requests were often delayed or ignored. The money that should have been used to improve the neighborhood was disappearing into folds of vague paperwork. One entry, in particular, stood out. It referenced a compliance partnership initiative involving Karen. There was no official description, no explanation of what services she allegedly provided, nor any record of her being formally employed by the HOA. Yet funds had been allocated, consistent sums that suggested ongoing compensation. This revelation strengthened the suspicion that Karen and the HOA board were intertwined in a mutually beneficial arrangement. Karen weaponized her vigilance to fuel the HOA's hunger for penalty revenue, while the HOA rewarded her informally behind closed financial statements disguised as administrative expenses. It was a cycle of profit powered by fear and compliance. With every piece of information uncovered, the magnitude of their wrongdoing became more evident. The homeowner realized this was no longer a case of defending against a baseless fine. It was about dismantling a structure built on deception. But the HOA sensed resistance. One evening, another envelope appeared on the doorstep. This one was marked urgent and carried an unmistakably stern tone. It stated that failure to comply with payment would lead to legal action. The message was written with strategic severity, designed to intimidate and force submission. But instead of fear, it invoked resolve. The homeowner knew the next phase would require exposing the HOA's misconduct not just quietly, but formally. And that meant presenting the evidence to authorities outside the community. Before taking that step, though, the homeowner needed something more powerful. Proof of the HOA actively bypassing their own rules, not just circumstantial evidence or neighbor testimonies. The breakthrough came unexpectedly, through a late-night discovery. While reviewing past HOA meeting minutes, the homeowner found several inconsistencies. Some decisions were recorded but had never been announced to residents. Others were vague or incomplete. But the most surprising revelation was that certain meetings where major fee increases and penalty rule changes had been approved, did not have a quorum present. According to bylaws, those decisions were invalid. Yet the HOA had enforced those rules anyway, collecting thousands of dollars in fines under illegitimate authority. This discovery was a turning point. It marked the moment where scattered suspicions solidified into verifiable violations. The HOA had not only mismanaged funds, it had actively broken its own governing laws. The homeowner created a dossier, a thick, meticulously organized compilation of evidence. It contained financial inconsistencies, testimonies, photographs, rulebook excerpts, and copies of invalid meeting minutes. It was a document strong enough to withstand scrutiny, detailed enough to prove intentional misconduct, and powerful enough to threaten the board's stability. But exposing the HOA to authorities would ignite a confrontation with consequences. The homeowner understood that once the complaint was filed, the HOA and Karen would not sit quietly. They would push back. They would retaliate. They would attempt to discredit everything and protect their system at any cost. The quiet suburban neighborhood felt different now. Every passing car seemed slower, every glance from a neighbor longer, every appearance of Karen more watchful. It was as if the community sensed something shifting in the balance of control. The turning point came the moment the homeowner, carrying the thick dossier, stepped out into the crisp morning air and headed toward the city's community regulatory office. It was an act that pierced the illusion of HOA invincibility, an act that threatened to unravel the board's carefully curated authority. Inside the office, the homeowner submitted the complaint, a comprehensive accusation backed by undeniable proof. The staff's reaction was immediate and serious. They had seen minor HOA complaints before, but nothing this extensive, nothing this systematic. They assured the homeowner that an investigation would begin promptly. Walking out of the building, the homeowner felt the weight of the decision. There was no turning back. The investigation would shake the entire neighborhood, and the consequences would reach far beyond a single fine. The power structures that had ruled through fear were about to be challenged by truth. As days passed, the HOA board began receiving inquiries from the city. The whispers around the neighborhood grew louder. Karen's confident walk transformed into a stiff, uneasy pace. The board members appeared more frequently at their clubhouse office, arriving early and leaving late, their faces marked with tension. The cracks were widening. The HOA's authority, once absolute, now trembled under the pressure of accountability. And the real battle had barely begun. The investigation progressed quietly at first, as if the city officials themselves understood the delicate balance of suburban politics. But the effects rippled through the neighborhood with noticeable force. The HOA board members appeared increasingly strained, their once confident expressions replaced with flickers of unease. Emails were sent out urging residents to remain calm, though no details were provided. The silence, rather than soothing the community, stoked their curiosity. Whispers floated across driveways and mailboxes. People exchanged glances filled with questions they were afraid to voice. Karen, once a constant presence on the sidewalks, now avoided eye contact, skirting around corners, her steps more restrained, her posture tense. The facade of control she had once wielded with pride was showing fractures. The homeowner, meanwhile, maintained a steady calm. The evidence had been submitted and acknowledged. The investigation was out of personal hands now, carried forward by officials who had the authority to demand records, question board members, and cross-check financial documents. But despite this transfer of responsibility, tension remained high. Exposing wrongdoing was only the first step. Ensuring accountability was the real challenge. Weeks passed, each one peeling back another layer of truth. The city demanded complete access to the HOA's financial statements, including those not previously shared with residents. They requested meeting recordings, internal emails, and all documentation related to fines and penalties issued over the past 3 years. The HOA attempted to delay, citing procedural complications, but the officials were relentless. Residents began receiving letters from the city asking them to confirm whether certain charges or fines had been issued to them and whether they had been given proper warnings. Many residents responded eagerly. Some provided copies of fines they had paid, while others shared their frustrations. Relieved to finally have an outlet to voice concerns without fear, it became increasingly clear that the HOA had relied on the silence and compliance of its members. But now that silence had broken, and a collective voice was rising to reveal the extent of the corruption as the investigation deepened, the HOA's defensive stance grew more transparent. Emergency meetings were scheduled without notice, their clubhouse lights burning late into the night. Some board members avoided stepping outside during the day. Their vehicles disappeared early in the morning and returned long after sunset. As if hoping to avoid running into residents, Karen's behavior changed most dramatically. The once patrolling figure, whose presence had been constant and overbearing, now moved with visible caution. She quickened her pace when passing homes, avoided familiar routes, and refrained from her usual habit of taking mental notes on neighbors' properties. Her sense of authority had dissolved, replaced by the realization that her involvement might soon be exposed. Then came the day when the city officials arrived in the neighborhood, not quietly, but in a manner that commanded attention. 2 vehicles parked in front of the HOA clubhouse, their presence unmistakable. Residents emerged cautiously from their homes, standing on porches or peeking through windows. Official badges were shown as investigators requested access to the clubhouse, and board members, unable to refuse, complied with forced politeness. The sight alone changed the atmosphere of the community. The sense of invulnerability that had once surrounded the HOA shattered in an instant. Those who had lived under its rigid control for years now watched with a mixture of relief and anticipation. That afternoon became a turning point. Inside the clubhouse, the investigators uncovered inconsistencies that validated the homeowner's claims. Financial records showed years of misallocated funds disguised as administrative expenses. Fines collected from residents had been diverted into unauthorized accounts or used to cover personal expenditures by board members. There were no proper contracts for certain services the HOA claimed to have paid for, including the so-called compliance partnership involving Karen. Most damning of all, meeting minutes had been altered. Evidence showed that at least 3 major rule changes had been pushed through without the required quorum or resident approval, directly violating the HOA's own bylaws. These changes were the same ones used to justify the inflated fines of recent years. The investigators did not hesitate. The findings were compiled into an official report, and before long, the community received a letter that would change its future. The HOA board was to be dissolved immediately. A temporary administrator appointed by the city would take charge until a new election could be held. All fines collected under invalid rule changes were declared unlawful and subject to full refunds. The total amount owed to residents exceeded $28,000, far more than even the board members had anticipated being exposed. The news spread through the neighborhood like a wave of long-awaited justice. Residents who had spent years quietly resenting the oppressive rules now openly expressed their relief. Some gathered on their lawns, talking animatedly about their experiences. Others simply watched from their porches, absorbing the moment with quiet satisfaction. Karen's downfall arrived in the form of an official notice delivered to her doorstep. The investigation had found that she had knowingly submitted false reports on multiple occasions, some of which had led to improper fines. While she had not been paid directly in the traditional sense, the HOA had provided her with gift cards, reimbursements, and under-the-table perks for her services. She was banned from participating in any future HOA-related activities and was issued a penalty for providing fraudulent information to a governing body. For someone who had built her identity around policing the neighborhood, the loss of influence was devastating. Her presence faded almost entirely, and she no longer walked the streets she once monitored with obsessive pride. The homeowner, though satisfied with the outcome, felt no triumph in Karen's downfall. Instead, there was a deeper, steadier sense of closure. Justice had been served, not through confrontation, but through persistence, patience, and truth. The fine that had sparked the entire journey was officially dismissed and expunged from all records. The $500 demand that had once symbolized injustice had now led to the entire neighborhood recovering tens of thousands in refunds. In the weeks that followed, the community slowly rebuilt a sense of trust. With the temporary administrator in place, new systems were created to ensure transparency. Residents were invited to meetings, encouraged to participate, and given full access to financial reports. For the first time in years, the HOA felt like a collective effort rather than a tool of control. The homeowner was approached by several neighbors who expressed gratitude for initiating the investigation. Some offered help, others offered stories, and many simply appreciated the courage it had taken to challenge the system. A sense of unity began to take root in the community, replacing the fear that once governed their interactions. The neighborhood settled into a quieter, more genuine harmony, one free from Karen's watchful glare and the board's financial manipulation. Life moved forward, but the memory of what had happened lingered as a reminder of how easily power can be abused and how important it is to stand up when something feels wrong. In the end, the homeowner kept the original fine notice, not as a source of anger, but as a symbol of resilience. It was a reminder that even the smallest act of courage, questioning an unjust fine, could lead to revelations that changed an entire community. And as the sun set over the once oppressive neighborhood, now revitalized with hope and clarity, it became clear that justice, though sometimes slow, had finally found its way home.